Okay, are you picking me up back there? Beautiful. So for the sake of time and short little legs, I'm going to talk about 3 buildings as we stand here. If you would like to go check them out later, you are more than welcome. So for those of you who have ever driven through this loop here in the front of the, there you go, in the front of LACS school, you'll know that on the other side there are a couple of houses. One of those was originally an operating bed and breakfast. Really quick story about that building. It was a doctor's house. The doctor passed away and he left the house to his wife. How many of you have ever been inside the school here at the front doors and realized that the one on one side says girls and one on the other side says boys? Okay? The school, those were put up in the 50s, but the school was actually segregated long before the 1950s. And so this doctor passed away. The wife kept the house. She didn't want to stay in the house any longer. So when she made out her will, she decided that she was going to leave the house to the school, and it was going to be the boarding house for all of the girls who attended school at Lowville Academy. She passed away, and her children started fighting over the fact that they had not been left the house. The interesting thing about that house over there on the other side is they never could get any paperwork signed inside the house except the one will that deeded that house to LACS school. What happened was the children would come and they would bring their lawyer and they would sit down. At the time, instead of going to the lawyer's office, the lawyer would come to you. They would sit down at the dining room table, they had the inkwell out, and they would say, "This is absolutely not fair, we want new paper drafted." The lawyer would bring the new paper, the solicitor would bring the new paper, he would sit down on the dining room table, he would dip his pen in the ink so that the kids could sign it, and the ink would spill, and the whole paper would be ruined. They did this 4 times before they realized that their mother was not going to let them sign that paperwork and take that house away from Lowville Academy. So they said, okay, we are going to come to your house. We want you to drop that exact same paper. We want the house left to us. We will come to your office to sign the papers. They went to the office to sign the papers. Her youngest daughter said she had kind of a queasy feeling in her stomach about the fact that maybe what they were doing was not quite right. Because after all, at that time, the girls had no place to stay, and so what they would have to do is they would have to stay at houses that were on the outer edges. They would stay in host houses, kind of like going to have a sleepover with people you didn't know for a whole school year. Remember when we were down at the Bateman and I told you there were 2 kinds of trolleys that came through there, 2 kinds of wagons? One brought salesmen, one brought school children. And so that would go around to the outer reaches of Lowville. It would pick up the girls, it would bring them to school. Another one would pick up the boys, it would bring them to school until the boys got their own boarding house. So this doctor's wife, their youngest daughter, thought, ugh, I don't know if we're doing the right thing. And as she entered the door to the solicitor's office, she stopped. And directly in front of her was a mirror. And she looked in the mirror, only she was not the only reflection that she could see there. Behind her, she could see the reflection of her mother. And she thought, I can't do this. I can't sign this paperwork. These were my mother's wishes. She doesn't want us to have that house. And she backed out and she said, nope, I'm done. I'm not signing the paperwork. And without her, the 4 children could not take the house back. So, that's the ghost story for the solicitor's office. Come back to the house over here. They're cleaning it out so that it can be turned into a boarding house for those young girls. And there's a mirror. The woman gets ready to leave after the house has been cleaned out. There's nothing left except some mirrors on the walls and a couple of things left in the kitchen. At that time, houses were built, so there was an entryway, and the mirror was hanging directly behind the door. The daughter walked outside, turned to grab the door handle and take one last look at the house where she had grown up, and directly in the mirror in front of her, she did not just see her reflection. She also saw behind her the reflection of her mother. She liked to tell the story to say that she felt her mother had followed them to the solicitors that day to let her know she could not sign that house away from the school, and then followed her back so that she could let her know she had done the right thing. Lots of girls who stayed in that house claimed to have seen shadows in the mirrors, but they always felt like the spirit was benevolent, and they fully believed it was because it belonged to the woman who owned the house and left the house to all of the girls so that they didn't have to live on the outer reaches of Lowville in order to come to school. Okay, see that stone building right there? That stone building is one of the oldest buildings in Lewis County. It is called the West House. It was actually owned by a father and then by his son, DeWitt basement walls are all of the things that they would have needed to make it a morgue at that time. Without getting into any of the gory details, because it's daylight and we're young, those are things you can't take out. There are troughs so that the room can be washed and drained. The woman who owns the house even now says she will not go in the basement, which is okay, because she's not sure she'd be able to get out again. The door to the basement will never, ever stay open. So down at the Bateman, or down at the Historical Society, we have a door that won't stay closed. The basement door that won't stay open. Part of the reason the door probably won't stay open, I'm just going to wait. Part of the reason the door probably won't stay open is because when the father would go down to do the work that he needed to do at the morgue on the already dead bodies, he didn't want to disrupt his family who was upstairs. So he would keep that door shut and he would keep that door locked from the inside. Thank goodness nothing ever scary ever happened to him that he had to run out of there in a minute. He would have had to crash through the door. That door won't stay open. The other thing that happens is the shutters on the house will open and close by themselves. One of the things that people would do if you had a family member house to see the doctor and passed away, your family member never came back out of that house. They went downstairs into the morgue and then they were transferred to the cemetery. So the family members, in protest, if someone passed away, would come along and they would clank the shutters on the outside of the house. The shutters on the house are now bolted open because even if it's not windy, they will not stay open. They will open and close of their own accord, which is really probably very scary if you're the person who lives inside. The last thing we're going to talk about right here is the Reed House. The Reed House became famous because it is known to be a stop on the Underground Railroad. Now, when I was a little girl, and for many, many years before that, right in the middle of the front yard was a big white fountain. It was rumored that there was an actual underground piece to the Underground Railroad that ran underneath the fountain. I don't know if that's true or not, but here's what I do know. 23, that house was built by Mr. Northrop for his wife. They owned a bunch of tanneries. So tanneries are places that take the hides off animals and turn them into leather. It was sold to Mr. Scott for $5,000. It was then sold to Mr. Richardson for $15,000. Going all the way back to the beginning, Mr. and Mrs. Northrop. Mr. Northrop died in the house. Mrs. Northrop died in the house. Mr. Scott died in the house. Mrs. Scott died in the house. Mr. Knapp died in the house. And Mrs. Knapp died in the house. They were not, however, the only people to die in the house. It's not uncommon, it is uncommon that 6 people in 3 generations would all pass away inside the house. Whether or not there are ghosts of those people left, I don't know. What I do know is this. After Mr. Northrop passed away, the man who built the house, his wife Eugenia came down with something called congestion of the liver. What that really meant was she was an alcoholic. She needed someone to take care of her after her husband passed away. She found, after advertising in the newspaper, a woman named Mrs. Richardson, who was from Jefferson County. She had family in Utica. She had moved from Utica to Jefferson County, and she agreed to come in and be what they call a companion for Mrs. Northrop. Essentially, her job was to be housekeeper, chef, cleaner, and to do all of the things that Mrs. Northrop couldn't do for herself. Unfortunately, Mrs. Richardson didn't have a husband either, and when she came to live here, she transferred the business that she had been running in Watertown to this house over here, and it became an opium den. Unbeknownst to Mrs. Northrop, who was an alcoholic and didn't realize what was going on, morphine and opium were being sold either out of the attic or the basement. They're not sure which because they can't verify the Underground Railroad piece of that building. Mrs. Northrop eventually died, but not before Mrs. Richardson died. And when they found Mrs. Richardson, she was in her room upstairs in the attic, and she had died from alcohol consumption and morphine overdose. She actually still had all of the paraphernalia that you use to inject yourself with morphine laying around her, and it was only after she passed away and people started coming to the house looking for her that they realized what she had been doing all of the time conversation with absolutely no one, and they would turn around and they would leave. The house itself is not necessarily haunted, but apparently the front yard and the porch are. Mrs. Richardson's ghost hung out long enough to tell all of the people who were buying morphine and opium from her that they couldn't enter the house. And we're not sure whether or not she told them that she was dead, but if you're ever walking by and it's late at night and you want to see if you can have a conversation with a ghost, feel free to walk up the front yard or walk up the driveway and see if Mrs. Richardson comes and approaches you. It's got to be interesting to see someone on the front lawn having a conversation with absolutely no one at all, and then to turn around and leave as if they've been given the answer to a question they didn't have in the first place.
Or if you see an ambulance fill up with a white jacket.
Okay, so we don't have a crosswalk here, but we are actually going to cross. So in order to do that, we're going to go back down to the crosswalk there and cross over.
I've been down there, we're walking.
Come on. I got your fire hat.